Hi everyone, welcome to this week's episode of Korea This Week. I'm your host, Sang Kim, and today we have our Kyle Ferrier, our fellow and director of academic affairs, with us. Thank you so much for joining us, Kyle.
Thanks for having me back.
Great. So before we get to the news item, I want to mention two of the KEI's upcoming events first, so that you are aware of all these very interesting events. So one, tomorrow we're having a movie event. It's called Geronimo, which is it's about a Korean who lived in Cuba and his very interesting story about growing up in Cuba and also his finding identity, and also for Koreans who live in Cuba as well. So the director, Joseph Chun, he will be here himself and to answer any questions about the film afterwards. So if you're interested, you are more than welcome to come. It's tomorrow at 5:30 through 8. And also, one other event I want to mention is on November 1st at noon, we're doing a book event co-sponsored with the Mansfield Foundation with Seth Berkman. He is the author of A Team of Their Own. It's about the joint inter-Korean women's ice hockey team from Pyeongchang Olympics, so it should be very interesting as well. So with that out of the way, let's get started with the news. So first, I want to talk about Korea-Japan because this continues to be the hot topic between two countries. But this week, South Korea's Prime Minister Lee Nak-yeon will visit Tokyo to attend the new emperor's enthronement. So he'll be there Tuesday to Thursday, and obviously this is a very high tension time, and of course having the second highest ranking officials going to Japan for the ceremony is a big deal. So, Kyle, could this be a breakthrough between the Korea and Japan relations?
It doesn't seem as if that is what's going to happen. Right now, there's been speculation, especially in this one article from the Nikkei, a Japanese newspaper, which has some inside sources, which said that Abe isn't necessarily that optimistic about the meeting, and he more or less stated to his close associates that this issue, that this meeting was only because he's one of the emperor's guests, and not necessarily one that he's trying to sort of reach a breakthrough on these talks on the Japan South Korea issue on the sidelines of the emperor's coronation in Japan. And I think South Korea too is hedging a little bit. I think if they thought that this was going to be an opportunity for a breakthrough between the countries, they may have actually sent over Moon Jae-in. Mm-hmm. So I think sending Prime Minister Lee is in one sense signaling how this is a high-level issue because he's the prime minister, right, and he's also a Japan specialist. Mm-hmm. But it's also hedging a little bit because if prime minister was to get rejected, it's not necessarily as strong as if Moon were to get rejected, and I think that helps to manage it a little bit more. It's a sort of offering a little bit of an olive branch, but also not going full out with sending Moon, which could cause a little bit more of a backlash if he were to be rejected. So I don't know necessarily if this is the way. This is necessarily the first step to resolve the issue. I think it could potentially continue to stay at this level or escalate further. I'm not sure. I'm not very optimistic, to be honest, about looking at Abe's comments about the outcome of the meeting.
Mm-hmm. Even the Prime Minister Lee going, when it was announced at first, it seemed a little controversial, especially on the Korean media side, saying like, "Oh, how could he go to the Japan event and such?" But like you mentioned, because South Korea is sending Prime Minister Lee, not the president is not going himself, so it does. In some of the priority rise of when other countries are sending head of states, the Prime Minister. And also the fact that Prime Minister Abe is meeting with a lot of other heads of states, that also limits the amount of time that Prime Minister will have, right, plus the other factor as well, right? So it still seems like, even though it seems like a diplomatic approach to send someone over for a ceremony, but not much will get out of it, unfortunately. So last week, KEI hosted an event with KIRA, Korea International Trade Association, on the Korea-Japan event. Could you tell us a little bit about the main takeaway from our event?
So there was a lot of different takeaways. On the economic side, the event really highlighted the role of South Korea in the global semiconductor industry. And Stephen Etzel from the Information Technology and Information Foundation had some really cool and key numbers about South Korea's role in the semiconductor industry worldwide. It's the second largest in terms of capacity. It's the second largest producer of semiconductors. And of those that are being produced in South Korea, only about 3%, I think he said, were destined for South Korea, the rest being for the world. So South Korea plays a really integral role in global value chains for semiconductors. If there's a disruption to the ROK side, to the South Korean side in semiconductors, then there could be a major disruption in global prices, which could upset anything from prices in military equipment, smartphones, a lot of different equipment that uses products that use semiconductors. So that was on the economic side, but then there on the program also highlighted how the political and economic sides are sort of more intertwined than they were before. And Shioko Goto from the Wilson Center was talking about how before, in previous iterations of tensions between Japan and Korea, economics was always separate from politics. But at this instance, in this juncture, economics and politics are being intertwined in both Japan and Korea. So economics are being dragged into the fore. And the only way it seems right now that we're going to have some sort of resolution to these major challenges, which Mr. Etzel was raising, is a political solution. So that's different from before, which we had known, but I thought she had some really good points on that as well. But on the U.S. side, another issue that we've been raising as this has come up, where's the U.S. in this position? Usually in the past, when there was some sort of raising of tensions between Japan and South Korea, the U.S. would play a role in stepping in terms of at least stabilizing, but that hasn't happened. And so we had someone from the Hill on board as well, talking about the role of the U.S. and she was very very direct in saying that the administration's not necessarily doing anything at this time, but Congress isn't necessarily taking on the burden that the White House is pushing off, because it's not something that has really translated to U.S. consumers just yet. And once we start to see a increase in consumer prices based off of the challenges to the South Korean semiconductor production line, then the Congress won't really take an active role, which I thought was very frank, and it suggests that this issue from the U.S. perspective isn't as high priority necessarily as we in the Korea policy community think it is. And then the last point had to do something again that Mr. Etzel had said, that if the U.S., Japan, and South Korea don't sort of come together and figure out a way to resolve this issue based on market principles and setting that up for the future of the semiconductor industry, all three sides could face a major challenge from Chinese competitors further down the road. China's not necessarily up to that level yet in terms of capacity for semiconductors, but if this is something that is going on in the medium to long term, and it certainly looks that way from our standpoint right now, our viewpoint right now, if it continues to be protracted, then it could be U.S., Japan, and South Korea ceding market share to Chinese competitors. Right.
It's really interesting you said that the Congress won't really take action until we actually see the visible impact on the consumer side. But if this continues, this will definitely impact the consumer side as well. Yeah. I mean, we all have cell phones, we all have cars, and other things that are related to semiconductors. And I feel like if we wait until that moment, it might be almost too late. But we'll see what happens. So earlier today, I saw a report that South Korean government mentioned President Moon possibly meeting with Prime Minister Abe at the APEC meeting in Chile. And of course, they added a caveat saying that it would only take place if Japan takes any visible, even constructive measures on the court case. So it's still, they are willing to approached diplomatically, but there are still, strings attached to it.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like you mentioned, Japan side, they're not so thrilled.
Yeah, South Korea has been very forthcoming in terms of trying to reach this diplomatic solution, but it seems as if Japan says we're continue to be too far apart to talk about anything. So we'll continue to see how this plays out in very public public events like the G20 or like their meeting at G20 and now the APEC meeting.
Right. So I want to switch gears and talk about China now, because this week, South Korea and China had a high-level strategic defense dialogue, which hasn't happened since 2014. Of course, 2015 was the big, tension with the THAAD deployment. So that was the big halt of the region. So moving forward, so the goal, according to South Korean government, the goal of this defense dialogue, restarting it is to have in-depth discussion on Korean Peninsula security conditions and also have talk about the mutual concern.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we expect this talk to have?
So there's a lot on the plate, and even though the THAAD retaliation issue is over officially, that's still something that weighs heavily on Chinese minds, and further deployments of THAAD and missile defense issues I think will certainly be raised. The U.S. alliance with South Korea is something that Beijing is very concerned about, and I know Korea will certainly want to raise a few things, particularly what happened this summer about incursions at Chinese airspace, Chinese planes sort of trespassing on South Korean airspace, and the Chinese weren't necessarily as big of intruders as the Russian airplane was in July, but they were a part of the same trilateral air exercise. So that's something that I'm sure the South Koreans will want to raise. But put against the broader geopolitical background, I mean, South Korea since the last dialogue of this kind has been a lot more cautious about how it approaches China. South Korean companies, especially Lotte, lost a lot of money. I think Lotte alone is estimated to have lost about $3 billion from the THAAD deployment after ceding the land to place the THAAD battery. So they've been very cautious about how they try to push back or any perceptions that could be seen to push back against China. And I think that there's, in terms of 5G, the U.S. has been very vocal about companies not wanting to use Huawei technology and building their 5G networks. In South Korea, there are 3 major providers. One of them was interested in using Huawei products, and rather than side with the U.S. and say, no, we won't allow these companies to use Huawei in their product line, the South Korean government said we're going to leave it up to these companies to decide for themselves. So the government is trying to distance itself from sort of actions that could lead to further THAAD retaliation. And something I think is also pretty interesting, especially for the Moon government, which is came into power off of the Candlelight Movement, massive democratic movement protest that I'm sure many people in Hong Kong look to for inspiration, has been pretty silent on what's going on in Hong Kong. And it's not just the Candlelight Movement. Moon has himself admitted that his administration and his party is a direct result of the Gwangju uprisings in 1980 against the military dictatorship of Chen Duan at the time, pushing for the same sort of democratic values that the people in Hong Kong are pushing for. So from an ideological perspective, there's a lot that South Korea and Hong Kong have in common, but I think some of these more tangible aspects of their relationships with China has kept South Korea a bit on the quiet side, and I think it has done that not just for South Korea, but it joins a long list of other companies and countries that have sort of distanced themselves from commenting too much on the Hong Kong issue, and China has clearly showed itself to take actions against those who are very vocal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, the China issue is definitely interesting because South Korea, Japan is not exactly on the happy side of relations, and also I'm sure South Korea needs to maintain a good relationship with China as well, especially with dealing with North Korea's. And China just had their high-level military talks with North Korea last week as well. So I'm sure some of the discussion that they will be having with the South Korean counterpart will also somehow intertwine with the discussion they have with North Korean counterparts. So we'll see what comes out of that talk. And lastly, I do want to mention the U.S. South Korea trade relations. And Auto 232, we thought it was over and done with. It's not officially over yet. So South Korean finance minister was here in D.C. last week to meet with other G20 finance ministers. Of course, he met with the U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin to talk about 232. So what do we know from their discussion?
Well, South Koreans have been very vocal about trying to have their auto industry treated fairly. And this was something that the administration had targeted very specifically. If you look at what the changes to the Chorus FTA were, they were pretty much solely focused on South Korean autos, and the U.S. being concerned about their having too much benefited too much under the agreement. So a lot of the changes to benefit the U.S. side were sort of taking away some of the tariff reductions and non-tariff barriers that South Korean car companies enjoyed. So they were South Korea had assumed that because of this inclusion of this working together with the United States on auto issues to include their auto concerns, that the 232 tariffs wouldn't apply to them. Now we know, as of earlier this year, that that's not true, and so the U.S. government has until November 14th to decide who to put on 232 tariffs on. So South Korea thought that talking more with the U.S., this would result in some sort of guarantee, because they had been so cooperative with the White House, that they would be that their interests would be served. But that hasn't been a guarantee, and South Korea isn't the only one that has done this. I think recently Japan signed a mini trade deal with the United States. And they had also hoped that this would protect the Japanese autos from being faced with the 232 tariff. And they explicitly asked for guarantees from the Trump administration and weren't given any. So I think we'll find out more specifically how the administration wants to proceed with these auto tariffs by November 14th, which is the deadline when they have to make an announcement.
Right. I mean, auto industry is such an important industry for South Korea. I mean, of course, for other countries as well. But in South Korea, 14% of production and also 12% of the employment in the country's manufacturing jobs is within auto industry. So obviously, this is a big part of South Korea's economy. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you understand why they are so anxious in finding out, they are exempt from the tariff. So. Yes. We don't know the final answer yet, even though South Korea is really pushing really hard, lobbying very hard, and having multiple layers of meetings about this. We'll find out November 14th.
Yes.
So with that, that's all the news we have for this week. So thank you so much for watching, and don't forget the 2 events that I mentioned in the beginning of the video about that KEI is hosting. And Kyle, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me again.
Great. We'll see you next week at 3.